Oh, thank you. I'm excited to be here. My bio was definitely pretty extensive. I'm going to add some photos so I can just kind of share, the intersectionality of not only my identity, but some of the privileges that I've had in being able to create this space for young people. A little bit about me. I'm Sarah. I went to UC Berkeley for undergrad and I went to Harvard for grad school. And something that really resonates is this quote from Arundhati Roy that says, "There's no such thing as the voiceless. There are only the deliberately silenced or the preferably unheard." And personally, I'm an only child. And really, it was not until I got to UC Berkeley and I started teaching in Title I high schools in Oakland and Richmond and nearby schools that I realized, while I had had the privilege and the access to have my voices heard because I went to private school, because my parents were on, the board, and really I had never felt voiceless as a young person. And so when I got into teaching in public high schools and realizing from the dress code to the lack of autonomy and agency that some of these kids felt while engaging with these systems. So in hearing all this feedback, I started to create and cultivate a space, not only a safe space, but more so a brave space where young people would have access to high quality, sewing instruction, which is typically, not represented in historically excluded and marginalized communities due to the cost of sewing. But going back a little bit about me, I have a great great grandmother who was an Ethiopian slave who was bought by a Confederate soldier at the age of 14. And through rape and pedophilia, they had a lot of kids. But more importantly, I recognize that that I'm the product of slavery, rape, and pedophilia, but also I come from an ancestry and a line of quilters. On the right is a quilt that my great great grandmother made, that my grandma has, and hopefully will gift to me, one of these days. A little bit about me. Again, I mentioned I'm an only child. I come from two college educated parents, definitely a California middle class child upbringing, private school. A bit about, my background. My grandma sewed. And so growing up as a babysitter, my mom would let me go over to my grandma's house and I'd sew. On the left is one of the first quilts I made. And I'd say by the time I was 8, I was really proficient at sewing. So here is 6th grade. I was in a lot of adult level quilting classes where, I know how to sew. So my mom would just pay hundreds of dollars for me to take classes to learn applique, curved piecing, paper piece, flying geese. I just learned techniques. And so really it wasn't due to any innate skill, but more so the socioeconomic privilege that my parents had to be able to afford for me to have the quality lessons to become good at sewing. So then by the time I was in 9th grade, I was really, making pretty phenomenal quilts. 8th, 9th grade. I could do adult level techniques that would take a traditional quilter maybe a year or so to finish. And I would say, my seams weren't always necessarily perfect, but I could get the technique done. And when you really look at it, it wasn't due to any, I'd say, like natural talent or anything, but more so child labor. When you go international on the intersectional lens, child labor and a lot of our clothes, quilts, and everything is made by kids in sweatshops in Indonesia, in Bali, in Thailand. So really, when you think of it, I was just doing it because my parents were affording me the opportunity to do it. But really, sewing doesn't require much skill. It requires practice. Just, in general, if anyone ever wants to learn how to sew, it definitely takes skill, but more important, it's expensive. The cost of cotton is like $15 a yard. To make a quilt is an easy $300 to $700 investment in fabric alone, not including time. So the purpose of sewing has really diminished due to exploitive labor and international, labor laws. But moving forward, I was doing really adult level techniques, and soon I moved over to fashion and I started doing prom dresses. And I have a pattern line, a collection. These are some things I made in 9th grade. I would make dresses with ostrich feathers and, really just enjoy fashion design. Fast forward, I got afforded the opportunity to write a book. So I wrote a book and I was teaching kids how to sew. So the book is called Sew with Sarah, and it has like 15 projects of tote bags and PJs and pillows and aprons and just stuff that you could make. And so then the kids would make it. I'd be teaching the class, and then they'd go on to, make their own products. And I really enjoyed the opportunity to teach kids how to sew. I have, book line, fabric line, DVD, pattern collection, Joann's, you name it. I was afforded a lot of opportunities due to being 13, 14 years old. So all this was happening before high school. And soon after teaching all these kids how to sew, I realized that, I was only really teaching white kids. And I say that, with love, because I wanted to teach kids how to sew. I wanted to bring it to a younger generation. But after a while, I realized that I was perpetuating so many systems of privilege, really socioeconomic privilege more than anything, but really the communities that I wanted to bring sewing to couldn't afford to take the classes. And because I was sponsored by Joann's and these extra capitalistic industry things, I couldn't controlled, what the class would go in. I'd go to Joann's to make this prom dress. It was $125 class, plus the fabric, plus the pattern, plus you'd have to come with all these extra sewing accoutrements that were, pretty hefty investment. So while, yes, I was loving teaching kids how to sew, I realized I wanted to have a more of a class that looked like me. So really the catalyst that really started the shift in my own design was February 26, 2012. I'm a senior in high school, and this is the month that Trayvon Martin got murdered. And I think what really was so pivotal in this ideology of my own socio-political development was that Trayvon got murdered February 26th, and my birthday was February 19th. So not only is this Black History Month, but it's like a week after my birthday. Come to find out, his birthday was 2 weeks prior, and we're both born in 1995. So what's important is we're both born in February. And hold on, guys, Cedric, Elijah, can you go into another room, please? Thank you. We're both born in February 19th, and I'm born February 19th. He's born February 5th. And so really it was just important because we're both, so close in the same age. And I think that the injustice in his murder really shook home and how, it just made me look at the world differently. So then it caused me to think of how and where I was spending my time. So then I made this quilt. I made this art quilt of Trayvon, and it's just an art quilt. It wasn't a pattern, and I wasn't trying to teach other people how to make this quilt. I was making it because, it mattered to me, and his murder really hit home. So I made this quilt, and I think what was really, a point where it's like I realized, who I was in the quilting industry prior to making this quilt. Every prom dress, apron, quilt, anything I made, quilt shops, quilt shows, spaces would display my work of like, Sarah made this, she teaches sewing, look at her artwork. I made this quilt and I entered it in quilt shows, and I entered it in county fairs, and I gave it to the quilt shops that had previously showed all my other quilts. Not one sewing industry space would hang this quilt up for display. And I made this quilt in March 2012. So it got finished about a month after he was killed. And so I'm showing it like in April. I'm applying for it to be entered in competitions. No one would even show the quilt. And I think that was really reflective of how conservative the quilting community can be at times. People like to sew, and I say people, I'm particularly speaking about white quilters, typically age 65 with an average income of $86,000 and at least 3 sewing machines. They typically like to sew for fun, and they don't sew, quote unquote, for politics or for real happenings in the world. They sew to get away. And I think as my identity as a young Black female, I don't have the privilege to sew pointless quilts with butterflies. And I don't have the privilege to make art without a purpose. I don't have the privilege anymore to make art without a message when there are bigger issues that are really hitting home with what matter to me. So I started making more social justice art quilts to the dislike of the quilting community. And I really kind of strayed away from teaching kids how to sew. And I was just like, well, let's cultivate spaces where we can let kids create art that matters to them. So after graduating from Berkeley, I talked to Berkeley. I got a research grant that allowed me to have a 6-week summer program for kids that I got to choose in the Bay Area through a short, brief application process to come and learn to sew and really do a critical race educational class on critical consciousness, reading poems and work and frameworks from Audre Lorde and James Baldwin and Toni Morrison, and really, Pedro Noguera, if you're into educational research, but really just using YPAR, which is Youth Participatory Action Research, and really just using a framework of empowering kids to be their own researchers, do their own methodology, and create research that can inform, enhance, and educate the communities that they're in. So with the grant that UC Berkeley gave us, every kid went to the fabric store, they bought their own fabric, they made their own art quilt, they embroidered their own art quilt. We had kids that were on probation, we had kids that were on ankle monitor. In the application, I specifically asked for GPA, and a lot of the kids had under 3.0s. And those were the exact kids that we brought in because it wasn't this typical sewing class for the straight A students who had grandparents who were invested in them. It was a sewing class for, the more at-risk kids who didn't have anything to do during the summer. And this was full free programming with lunch included at UC Berkeley. So this is what we did. We had over 30 kids. Some of the examples, they made quilts on sexual assault. They made quilts on their experience riding public transportation and catcalling. They made quilts on Black men getting killed by police, Eric Garner getting choked out. And then soon after that, the program ended. All the kids had a really, it was a really powerful workshop. They kind of all asked for it to go to traditional schools, but I was getting ready to start my master's program at Harvard. So I moved to Cambridge, and I wasn't 21 yet. So due to a bit of an inability to connect to some of my peers due to the age group. I just started making a smaller workshop model where I'd offer a free workshop to local high schools in Cambridge and Dorchester and Brockton, just all around kind of Massachusetts. I'm like, hey, my name is Sarah. I taught this summer program that was about sewing last summer. Can I do a smaller workshop with your class model? So those are some of the questions. If anyone on here is an educator and would like some of our curriculum, feel free to shoot us an email. We've got extensive curriculum that's really an arts-based curriculum where you can ask questions of scaffolding, where kids become not just activists, but artivists, obviously a hybrid of artist and activist. The framework of all the workshops and all the work we do is definitely developed through critical consciousness, and it's just about reflection mixed with dialogue can lead to action. So we're making this art, with a purpose to bring awareness, but then also a purpose and a call to action to do something about it. All our workshops, all ages, we do workshops with everyone from elementary school to high school to undergrads to juvenile halls to homeless shelters to adult jails. There's not a one size fits all. We have curriculum that's also scaffolded based on the critical conscious level that someone could assess that their kids are in. For example, when we go into high school in Chicago, we will have an activity set for the demographic of what that school is. And if we're in a more affluent LA suburb, we might do a workshop based on privilege and intersectionality and understanding and unpacking privilege, power, and oppression. So it's definitely, we have a range of curriculum and we apply workshops to the demographic that we think would most engage with the workshop model. These are some of the sketches that young kids have done. This was his block, and while he didn't write an artist statement because he was 6, he transcribed, and his artist statement this was a workshop in Chicago, and gang violence had taken the life of his older brother. And so his block was on how gangs need to stop the violence, and we've got to do something to protect older brothers from going down that lifestyle. Community, it's everyone's problem. This is just examples of what groups of workshops look like. Sometimes people look on their phones, they find inspos on Instagram, Twitter, but really they're making a block about what social justice issue matters to them. Workshop size can be as small and intimate as 8 and has been as large as 200 at a time. And so at the end of the workshop, we end up with a lot of blocks that these kids have made. And so they're 15-inch fabric blocks, and they've glued on designs of what they want. And so the workshops are no sew, they're just social justice education and textile workshops. And then we have this process where the kids do a workshop, then I take their blocks and I mail them to an embroidery volunteer. An embroidery volunteer is an adult, predominantly I'd say white quilters, are the ones who are signing up, and we mail their blocks across the US to be hand embroidered by an adult volunteer who knows how to sew. So the kids' blocks are fabric and glue. I send them to a volunteer, the volunteer sends them back, and now the block has been entirely hand sewn, and the hand sewing permanently secures all the pieces so they can never fall off. Because if you just use fabric and glue, eventually the fabric and glue pieces will fall off. Then we have sew days, step 3, where we take all the blocks together and we sew them together. We give them to a long armor, another quilting step. And then 5, last but not least, and obviously the most important, is we have the artwork scene. We have the artwork scene in spaces, museums, community centers, libraries, quilt shows, really every and anywhere that wants to show youth art. And if you look at the youth art, these are some of the blocks that came from one workshop. We'll gather 20 together. Again, a group of volunteers that will help us sew it together. And these are what the final quilts look like. And they're really intergenerational, powerful textile collaborations between high school kids who have visions, ideas, and things they want to say, and a community that's often not listening to kids in the first place. We're going to take the time to hand embroider. Not only will they hand embroider, but then they'll add, embroidery, or they'll add details or any instruction that the kid has given them. In a quick look, I can see that this Baltimore block is on redlining, and it has zip codes of white affluent communities and inner city communities. This block is on colorism. This block is on a young man feeling profiled just for wearing a hoodie. This block is on indigenous land and water. This block is on plastic in the ocean. This block is on food deserts and gardens. This block is on Islamophobia. This block is on income inequality, police brutality. The range in what kids are making art about is any and everything. There's not a one size fits all. I have a story that I could share about Becca, but basically Becca is 12 years old, and she made this block on gender binaries, on how her older sibling isn't always accepted due to his or their gender expression. But due to time, I'm going to kind of fast forward. We've got lots of kids, in addition to just making blocks, kids that are really engaged in the workshop. They want to say, hey, I want to make a full quilt. So we have weekend workshops in conjunction with guilds where kids can come through and make a full quilt. This is Brian's quilt. His quilt is an American flag with nooses hanging silhouettes and someone rising above it, which stands for him, of getting a diploma but not recognizing who he comes from, and the legacy of American history that's often not mentioned in American history classes. We have kids, Audrey. This is Audrey's second quilt. I don't know if you're familiar with Bisa Butler. Bisa Butler is not only a personal friend, but a phenomenal art quilter that's really trend setting right now. In fact, her current quilt right now is on the cover of Times New Magazine. Like, she's an art quilter that's making quilts of people, but it looks like paintings with African fabric. She's phenomenal, but really, I can say with all, no shadow of a doubt, there's kids that are as naturally talented, could be the next Bisa Butler, but they don't have parents, as Bisa could send her to Howard to get a master's in fine arts. They don't have parents, how I had, who could spend thousands per year on sponsoring, an artistic craft and art form. But Audrey is just an amazing, talented teen from Baltimore who made this quilt of, kids in immigration centers. We have kids who will go through the workshop, enjoy the process, and then they will become facilitators. This isn't an adult-led organization. We have a youth council, and centering youth experiences and leadership is really kind of core of who we are and how we want to operate. This is Bianca. Right now she's 19, but she became a workshop facilitator at the age of 17. So she'd be flown around by different high schools. A teacher would host her, a female teacher, and she'd have her own bedroom, and she'd go into the high school class and teach other high school students how to make art. This is the quilt that she made individually. So this quilt is called Activist ABCs. She was 17 when she made it, and it just features A is for abortion or abolition, B is for Black Panther, C is for colorism, diversity, educational equality, Holocaust, gentrification, Jesse Jackson, Obama, school to prison pipeline. Like, she just made these beautiful art blocks. And in these close-ups, you can see Bianca cut and glued the design. A hand embroidery volunteer hand stitched all these stitches. The hand embroidery volunteer added the words she wanted. Here, the hand embroidery volunteer added barbed wire and a fence she wanted. And then the long arm volunteer went behind and did all the stitches that you can see in the background. So really the entire model is very much youth are leading and directing it, but there's a community of volunteers behind them that help make the art not only beautiful, but permanent. More examples. P is for white privilege. They added quilting arrows pointing to this silhouette. G is for gentrification, the echoing of the ramifications of gentrification for Black and brown communities. There's a lot. School to prison pipeline. She quilted over barbed wire. You can see the stitches there. So really, and even V is for vote. It's a square opening. So these circles don't fit into a square very easily. Just talking about historically, marginalized communities when it comes to voting and voter suppression. These are examples of what the community quilts look like. These are, again, so 20 kids made 20 blocks, 20 adults embroidered 20 blocks, and then a team of adults sewed all the blocks together. So as you can see, police badges, an excuse to kill, and Black Lives Matter, and the system is built this way, and hands up, don't shoot, and end gun violence. Like, whatever youth want to make art about is what they make art about. We just provide them the fabric as the blank canvas for them to create. We have 2 projects that are currently happening. If anyone does know a sewer or wants to get involved, we have Quilts of Remembrance, where we are making full quilts for families who've lost someone to violence, whether that's violence from law enforcement, whether that's violence from domestic abuse, whether that's just community violence or drive-by. We're making quilts for these families with clothing from their loved one. Junior was a young man who was killed in LA by police during a mental health crisis. He was unarmed. These are his 2 daughters, and this is his younger sister and his family. This is Cameron Lamb's mom. I don't know if you're familiar. Cameron Lamb was in his grandma's garage, and he got shot and killed by police because they were looking for a Black man who had robbed someone. Come to find out, it was the wrong Black man, but they killed him anyway, and they gave his mom a $1 million settlement. This is his family. These are his sons. This was his favorite hoodie. And so the families will send us clothes of their loved one, and then we will pair it with a quilter who has the time, talent, more importantly, the privilege to do this as a complete labor of love. Quilting, again, is a $500-$600 fabric cost plus a $200-$300 long arming cost, not to mention the 40 or 60 hours of time it takes to make these quilts. This is Danny. Danny was, again, another young man murdered in Southern California. When we gave his mom his quilt, she cried. Those are his 3 kids. This is his family. He was a Dodgers fan. This was his favorite towel. This is his 2 t-shirts for the flooring company he worked for. This is the custom Daniel logo that the quilter made, because she has that capacity to create custom logos. And this was a Dodger symbol because those are his favorite teams. And additionally, we have the Remembrance Project, which was mentioned before. The Remembrance Project is very similar to the 21st century version of the AIDS quilt, but it's far more intersectional in who's being remembered. We've got people who are murdered from, we have 4 categories. We have community violence, which is just violence that's happening in the community. We have racially motivated, which is more so hate crimes and intentionality of being killed. We have law enforcement, and we have domestic violence and LGBTQIA women and people who are just murdered. And so the artist statements are being made, and you can read the artist statements, you can read what happened, but really it's a call to action. So it starts with the block. Isaiah Lewis was naked, unarmed, and killed in Oklahoma. Alton Sterling was a man who was selling CDs, choked out by police. Royda was an 8-year-old accidentally killed by someone else shooting, wrong person, wrong place. Walter Scott, young man. Olatoyan, young girl on Twitter who was looking for housing, reached out to someone who she thought was an ally who ended up raping and killing her. David Felix killed in an accidental, gang shooting, but it wasn't meant for him. Junior killed by police, wanted to become a CIA agent. Like, the stories are there. Summer Taylor was a young white ally in Portland who was killed when some racist ran through a crowd trying to kill people at the Black Lives Matter protest. Jordan Edwards, 11-year-old playing with a gun, who was killed. Monica, trans woman. The stories are endless, and really, if you take the time to read them, we have them on Instagram, and we have a book that we wrote, is a really call to action to get people to engage with the project. Some names are well known: Michael Brown. Some names: Rhea was a young trans woman. There's so many stories, and really there's too much violence happening. So the art project is really to bring awareness. These are what the banners look like when they're finished. We take the raw blocks and we sew them in a pair with another banner, and we have a color code system. If you notice, if blue is in the corner, that means they were killed by law enforcement. If purple is in the corner, that means it was domestic violence or a transgender young person who's murdered. If green is in the corner, that's community violence. And there's another color code that's not mentioned. Ways to get involved: we have a learning community, we have projects you can get involved with. If you don't know how to sew, we've got lots of other projects that you could always reach out to get involved with. Or even if you just know a space, you can schedule an exhibition. This is a brief sampling of what the art looks like, but we have a very vast collection of youth art, from issues ranging from environmentalism to school policies being problematic, to sexism, to income inequality, to presidential, everything. Youth make art about any and everything. So if there's any type of exhibit you want to have, I would just encourage people to always consider, youth perspective matters too. And when we think about art, you have to question whose art is valuable, what kind of artists get reinforced that their work is important, and encouraging the next generation can really go a long way. But with that being said, I'm done.
Thank you so much. Just reading some of the comments in the chat room. Awesome, powerful, beautiful, so important. And I would add inspiring and pioneering. The work that you're doing is just tremendous. And thank you for what you're doing, for all the lives that you're touching, and all the people that you're accompanying and coming alongside, and as they grieve, as they seek voice, as they seek empowerment. Just so important. And I know that there are going to be a lot of people probably reaching out to you who are on this call behind this presentation. One question that did come up, just sort of an informational question that came up right away, was the sewing machine that was pictured alongside the Berkeley book. Kimberly Tucker, one of our participants, asked, "Is that your grandmother's sewing machine?"
No, my grandma didn't give me her machine. She's still alive in Alabama, and a very stubborn woman. So she has her stuff. I hope to inherit it. But no, that is a sewing machine I buy at flea markets. People donate us sewing machines. And so I really like to buy antique machines to kind of, understand that there can be a lower barrier to entry with sewing. Sewing machines work. And if you can thread one, you can thread any. But at this point, we accept fabric donations, we accept sewing machine donations, we accept scissors, rotary cutters, anything. And as kids go through our program, they leave with the How to Sew Starter Pack, which, if you're in the crafting industry, is really unheard of because sewing is so expensive. But by using the intergenerational model and connecting quilters who have a surplus with kids who really don't have the opportunity or the means to afford it, it's very much like a Robin Hood cycle where people will donate and make sure that these kids, I can put on the Instagram, we have a kid, she needs $300 to make a quilt. Can someone please sponsor this? And they show up. And I think that, they show up with their time, they show up with their talent, and they show up with their money to really help support these kids, as they know sewing is expensive. And when people are going to declutter their stash, they'll give us. And again, all fabric is pretty expensive, particularly quilting cottons. So by having a free open model where people can donate, it really allows us to provide a lot of programming to a lot of youth.
Thank you so much, Ms. Trail.